The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson wasn't just a late-night show, it was a cultural phenomenon. For 3 decades, it captivated audiences and cemented Johnny.
For years, Johnny Carson sat behind the desk of The Tonight Show like he owned the entire world of late-night television. His approval could make a comedian famous overnight. His invitation could turn an unknown performer into a household name. And when Carson truly trusted someone, he didn't just bring them onto the show once. He brought them back again and again. One comedian became especially important in that world. Her name was Joan Rivers. When Rivers first appeared on The Tonight Show in 1965, she was still fighting to establish herself in a comedy business dominated by men. She was quick, fearless, and willing to make jokes about subjects other comedians avoided. Carson immediately recognized that she had something special. Over the years, Rivers became a familiar face on the program. She wasn't simply another guest. She became one of Carson's trusted performers and eventually his permanent guest host. When Carson was away, Rivers could step behind his desk and keep the show moving. That was an extraordinary position. She knew the writers. She knew the producers. She knew how Carson's show operated from the inside. Most importantly, she knew Carson himself. For a while, their professional relationship seemed almost perfect. Carson had given Rivers a major platform, and Rivers had proved that she deserved it. But behind the scenes, the television industry was changing. By the middle of the 1980s, Carson was getting older and appearing on fewer nights. NBC executives were quietly thinking about the future. The question was no longer whether Carson was the king of late night. Everyone knew he was. The question was who would eventually replace him. Rivers had every reason to believe she might be considered. She had experience. She had already hosted the program. She understood late-night television better than almost anyone. But then something happened that reportedly shocked her. A confidential NBC memo discussing possible successors to Carson was leaked, and Rivers discovered that her name wasn't included among the serious contenders. For someone who had spent years sitting beside Carson, that was a painful realization. She had been trusted enough to host the show, but apparently not trusted enough to inherit it. And then another opportunity appeared. Fox. At the time, Fox was a new and ambitious television network trying to challenge the established giants. The network wanted a major late-night program, and it wanted someone recognizable enough to make people pay attention. They wanted Joan Rivers. The offer was enormous. Fox wasn't asking her to become another guest host. They wanted her to have her own show. And there was one enormous problem. The show would compete directly with Johnny Carson. Rivers now faced a decision that could change her entire career. Stay with NBC and continue waiting, or leave the network that had made her famous and build something of her own. According to contemporary accounts, Rivers accepted Fox's offer. The announcement stunned the television industry, because this wasn't just any comedian leaving The Tonight Show. This was Johnny Carson's former protege, his permanent guest host, the woman who had spent years sitting beside him, and now she was going to launch a competing late-night show. For Rivers, the decision was about opportunity. For Carson, it looked very different. Carson reportedly felt betrayed that Rivers had not personally told him about the deal before it became public. Rivers later gave a different version of events. She maintained that she had tried to reach Carson and that she had been placed in an impossible situation. She also argued that her conflict was primarily with NBC and the way the network had handled her career, rather than with Carson personally. But whatever the exact sequence of conversations, something between them broke. And it broke badly. The public announcement turned a long-time professional relationship into one of television's most famous rivalries. On October 9th, 1986, The Late Show starring Joan Rivers premiered on Fox. For one night, the story looked almost perfect. Joan Rivers had her own desk, her own show, her own network. She was no longer sitting beside Johnny Carson. She was competing with him. The premiere attracted enormous attention. Rivers had major guests, including Elton John, Cher, and Paul Rubens. Everyone wanted to know whether she could actually challenge a man who had dominated late night for decades. But the real battle wasn't simply about ratings. It was personal. Carson had helped Rivers rise. Now she was standing across from him. And according to accounts of the dispute, Carson's relationship with Rivers was effectively over. The woman who had once been trusted enough to host his show was no longer welcome on it. There was no dramatic on-air explosion, no famous insult. No moment when Rivers walked onto the stage and publicly attacked Carson. Instead, the break happened behind the scenes. A contract, a network, a decision, and a friendship that could not survive it. That is what makes a story so fascinating. People often imagine that Joan Rivers was banned from The Tonight Show because of something outrageous she said on camera. But the real story was much quieter, and, in some ways, much more painful. She had been given an opportunity to become independent. She took it, but the price of that independence was losing one of the most important professional relationships of her life. And the consequences were only beginning. The new Fox program struggled to establish itself. Fox was still a young network, and competing directly against Carson was an enormous challenge. Carson already had decades of audience loyalty behind him. Rivers had talent. She had fame. She had experience. But she was trying to defeat the man whose show had helped create her television career. The pressure was enormous. Within months, the dream began falling apart. Rivers was eventually fired from the program in 1987. The failure was devastating enough on its own. But then her personal life suffered an even greater tragedy. Her husband, Edgar Rosenberg, died by suicide in August 1987. Suddenly, the story was no longer just about late-night television. Rivers was dealing with professional failure, the collapse of her relationship with Carson, and unimaginable personal grief. Yet she survived, and that became one of the defining characteristics of Joan Rivers. She kept working. She rebuilt herself. She returned to stand up. She appeared on television. She developed businesses. She reinvented her public image. And eventually, she became much more than the woman who had once been Johnny Carson's guest host. She became Joan Rivers. But the Carson story never completely disappeared. For years, people continued asking whether she regretted leaving. Did she regret taking the Fox offer? Did she regret competing against Carson? Did she wish she had handled the announcement differently? And most importantly, did she ever hope that Carson would forgive her? Rivers continued to speak about Carson with complicated feelings. She remembered him as someone who had played a huge role in her career. She also maintained that she had been trying to protect her own future. That is why there is no simple villain in this story. Carson believed loyalty mattered. Rivers believed opportunity mattered. NBC wanted to protect its late-night institution. Fox wanted to challenge it. And Joan Rivers was caught in the middle of all of it. The decision she made in 1986 changed her life. It also changed her relationship with Johnny Carson forever. For years afterward, she would not return to his Tonight Show. The silence became part of their history. And the longer it lasted, the more mysterious the entire story became, because there had once been genuine respect between them. There had once been laughter. There had once been trust. Then one career decision destroyed it. And perhaps the most heartbreaking question is one that can never really be answered. What would have happened if Rivers had simply called Carson before accepting the offer? Would he have understood? Would he have wished her well? Would he have helped her negotiate? Or would the relationship have ended anyway? We'll never know. What we do know is that Joan Rivers chose to take the biggest professional gamble of her life. She wanted to stop being the person sitting beside the king. She wanted to become the person sitting behind her own desk. And she got exactly what she wanted. But the cost was extraordinary. She gained independence. She lost Carson. And for decades, one of television's most powerful doors remained closed to her. That is the real mystery behind the story. Not what Joan Rivers said. Not some shocking joke, not an on-air scandal, but one decision made behind the cameras that permanently changed two careers. And the next chapter would reveal just how badly that decision would haunt her. The more people looked into what happened that night, the stranger the story became. The incident was not simply about a celebrity making an uncomfortable joke or saying something that television executives disliked. The real issue was what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. For years, Carson's show had been built around a delicate balance. Guests could be outrageous, unpredictable, even insulting, as long as the conversation remained entertaining. That freedom was one of the reasons viewers loved the program. But there were limits, and every once in a while, a guest crossed one of them. According to the story surrounding this particular appearance, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. What began as a normal conversation gradually became tense. Carson tried to steer the discussion back toward lighter territory, but the guest continued pushing the subject. And then came the moment that allegedly changed everything. The audience reaction was mixed. Some people laughed. Others became noticeably uncomfortable. Carson himself appeared to recognize that the conversation had gone somewhere the producers did not want it to go. That was a dangerous part of live television in Carson's era. There was no easy way to erase a moment once it happened. No social media editor could cut the clip within minutes. No producer could simply remove an offending sentence from a digital upload. Millions of viewers had already heard it. Behind the scenes, however, the reaction was reportedly much stronger. Producers were accustomed to difficult guests. Carson had interviewed comedians who insulted him, actors who refused to answer questions, musicians who arrived in bizarre moods, and celebrities who simply walked away from interviews. But there was a difference between being difficult and creating a situation that could damage the program. The Tonight Show was one of the most powerful television platforms in America. Appearing on Carson could transform a relatively unknown performer into a household name overnight. But that power worked both ways. Carson could also decide that someone was no longer welcome. And that is where the mystery begins. There was no dramatic announcement telling viewers that the guest had been banned. No official statement appeared on television. Instead, the invitation simply disappeared. She was not brought back. At first, nobody thought much of it. Carson had hundreds of guests during his long career, and not everyone returned. Some appearances were one-time promotions. Others simply faded from memory. But this particular absence became noticeable because of the guest's popularity. She had every reason to appear again. That was what made the situation so intriguing. When other entertainers had awkward moments on the program, they often returned months or years later. Carson was surprisingly forgiving when he believed the guest was genuinely talented. Even people who had embarrassed themselves sometimes received another opportunity. But in this case, the second invitation never came. Fans began wondering whether the original appearance had something to do with it. The rumors became more interesting as the years passed. Some claimed Carson personally disliked what had happened. Others suggested that the show's producers had decided she was too unpredictable. Another version suggested that the guest had offended someone powerful behind the scenes. The problem is that the surviving evidence does not provide a single clean explanation. That uncertainty is exactly what allowed the story to grow. Carson rarely explained his private decisions publicly. He did not spend his later years giving interviews about every guest he disliked. His philosophy was largely simple. Television was entertainment, and once an appearance was over, he moved on. That silence created room for speculation. There was another important factor. Carson had an extraordinary memory for people. He could remember performers who had appeared years earlier and bring up details from previous conversations. If he genuinely enjoyed someone, audiences could often tell. The reverse was also true. When Carson was uncomfortable with a guest, the change in his behavior could be subtle. His smile became smaller. His questions became shorter. Instead of encouraging a story, he might simply wait for the guest to finish. For viewers watching decades later, those tiny moments can look almost meaningless. But people who worked in television understood them differently. Carson was a host, but he was also the center of a massive production machine. His reactions could influence how producers viewed a guest. A performer who made Carson uncomfortable could become a much harder booking the next time around. And this particular appearance apparently left enough of an impression that another invitation never materialized. The strange thing is that the guest did not disappear from Hollywood. She continued working. Her career continued producing appearances, projects, interviews, and public attention. She was not blacklisted by the entire entertainment industry. She simply stopped appearing on one of the most influential talk shows in American television. That distinction matters. A person can have a successful career and still lose access to one particular platform. And Carson's platform was enormous. At the height of The Tonight Show, appearing beside Carson could mean reaching an audience that modern celebrities can only dream about. A successful appearance could increase record sales, movie tickets, book sales, or comedy bookings. So when someone stopped appearing on the program, people noticed. Years later, the story became part of the mythology surrounding Carson. Was she truly banned? Or did Carson simply decide that he did not want to interview her again? Those are two very different things. A formal ban would suggest an explicit decision by the network or production team. A personal decision by Carson would be much quieter. And Carson was known for making quiet decisions. He did not need to publicly announce that someone would never return. If he did not want a guest back, The booking simply did not happen. That may be why the story has survived for so long. There is no spectacular final confrontation preserved for everyone to watch. Instead, there is a strange gap in the guest television history. One appearance, one controversial moment, and then silence. The silence itself became the mystery. Looking back today, it is tempting to imagine that Carson must have stormed backstage or ordered the producers never to book her again. But the reality of television was usually less theatrical. Decisions were often made in offices, during production meetings, or in quiet conversations between executives and staff. Sometimes a guest simply received fewer calls, then no calls, then eventually everyone forgot why, except the audience. And that is why this story remains fascinating. It reminds us that Johnny Carson's Tonight Show was not simply a place where celebrities came to promote their latest projects. It was a world with its own unwritten rules. You could be funny, you could be controversial, you could even surprise Carson. But there was one thing you could not afford to become. Someone Carson and his producers no longer trusted. And once that trust disappeared, getting back onto the couch could be nearly impossible. The guest continued her career without Carson. But every time her name came up in discussions about the legendary talk show, the same question returned. What exactly happened that night? And why was she never invited back? The story of Joan Rivers and Johnny Carson is one of the strangest chapters in late-night television. Rivers had been more than just another comedian on Carson's couch. She had become one of his most trusted guests and eventually a regular guest host. Her rise was closely connected to the opportunities Carson gave her. That is what made the eventual fallout so shocking. In 1986, Rivers accepted an offer to host a new late-night program on Fox. The problem was not simply that she was leaving. It was that Carson reportedly learned about the deal before Rivers had personally told him. For someone who valued loyalty so strongly, the way the news reached him was deeply significant. Suddenly, the woman who had once been welcomed into Carson's inner circle was no longer welcome on his show. The consequences were severe. Rivers was banned from appearing on The Tonight Show, and the source material describes a ban as lasting for decades. She later tried to repair the relationship, but according to the reference, Carson never reconciled with her before his death in 2005. There was also another layer to the story. Over the years, rumors circulated about the closeness between Rivers and Carson. Some speculation went far beyond their professional relationship, but there is no concrete evidence supporting the more sensational claims. That distinction matters because a documented professional dispute is already dramatic enough without turning rumor into fact. For Rivers, the decision ultimately became one of the defining moments of her career. She had gained enormous visibility through Carson, but she was now attempting to build something completely separate from him. And Carson's reaction showed just how powerful the Tonight Show booking system could be. Being invited onto Carson's stage could elevate a comedian overnight. But losing that invitation could also close one of television's most valuable doors. The reference material describes The Tonight Show as an enormous gatekeeper for Hollywood careers. Rivers was not the only performer to discover that Carson had limits. Rich Little, famous for his impressions, eventually found himself in a similar position. Little had repeatedly impersonated Carson, even performing versions of him on television. At first, Carson appeared willing to laugh along, but eventually Little's invitation stopped. Little later suggested that Carson had objected to being mocked too frequently, while producers offered a different explanation. Then came Dana Carvey. Carvey's Carson impression was sharp enough to attract attention, but Carson apparently did not appreciate being portrayed that way. During a Tonight Show appearance, Carvey performed the impression directly in front of him. According to the reference material, that was effectively the end of Carvey's relationship with the show. But Rivers' story remained different. Her situation was not simply about a bad joke or an embarrassing stunt. She had been close to Carson. She had been part of the show's extended family. Then she made a career decision that Carson reportedly viewed as a personal betrayal. And that is why the headline, "She was never allowed back on the Johnny Carson show after this," carries so much weight. The shocking part wasn't that Rivers failed to make Carson laugh. It was that someone who had once been trusted enough to host a show could suddenly become someone Carson would not speak to again. The lesson of the story is not that Carson controlled every career in Hollywood. Clearly, Rivers went on to build an enormous career of her own. But during the Carson era, appearing on that stage meant something extraordinary. And once the relationship was broken, there was apparently no going back. For years, viewers could only watch old clips and wonder what might have happened if the two had reconciled. They never got that ending. Johnny Carson remained one of television's most powerful figures until his retirement, while Joan Rivers continued carving out her own place in comedy. Two legends, one decision, and a friendship that, according to the surviving accounts, never recovered. But the story did not end with Joan Rivers. Carson's Tonight Show became famous for the power it gave its host. A comedian could arrive relatively unknown, deliver one great performance, and suddenly find doors opening across Hollywood. But that same platform could become dangerous when a performer crossed Carson's personal boundaries. One example was Bobcat Goldthwait. During a 1994 appearance, Goldthwait's unpredictable behavior became the kind of television moment people remembered for years. His comedy was deliberately chaotic, and Carson's successors would later deal with performers who pushed the boundaries even further. The broader lesson was clear. Late-night television depended on trust between the host, guests, producers, and audience. Carson himself had a reputation for being especially uncomfortable when guests surprised him with something he had not been prepared for. That was exactly what happened with Howie Mandel.